Hello everybody, Eddie here, Risk Management Lecturer of Think APM. I'm going to discuss with you about Risk Management Assessment 2 or Final Report. Now we would recall that Assessment 1, which was due in week 4, was about established risk context, where we completed the assessment by detailing the events, the project that we conducted for risk management. That includes the goal, the processes, legislations, external factors, strengths and weaknesses, and communication side of it. Now, for assessment 2, we actually continue that. So for this final report, which is due in week 10, we continue what we have done in part 1. So remember, this assessment is due in week 10 and it is weighted as 40%. So after we establish the risk context, we now identify the risk. In this instance, there are a few tasks under risk identification that we need to complete. The first one is explain the communication or consultation process with the stakeholders to identify risks of the above events. You would recall you also analyzed or explained the communication side of the assessment 1. It, it was in the context of gaining support from the stakeholders. Now this one here is in the context of identifying risk. So what do we do to communicate with the stakeholders in order to gain their support in risk identification? The second one under risk identification is we identify the risk itself. Here we need to at least identify 5 risks. So if the previous task is to identify, to communicate to the stakeholders in terms of risk identification, so assessment A2, task A2 is basically to identify 5 risks. Now the risk could be, the risk or risk event could be using a few methods like the ones in here, like using data, statistical information, lessons learned from the other project or the previous project. Sometimes we conducted a project which was conducted previously, so we could learn from the previous event or project. Or we might do market research, or again experience, or consultation with the stakeholders, or the other thing that we might, the other source that we might have would be literature review or online research to identify the risk. Now, task A3 is basically using the tools or techniques discussed in class to reveal the risk events, the 5 risk events. In here, aside from the data that we talk about for task A2, here we need to explain the tools or techniques such as the fishbone diagram, brainstorming, checklist, or flowcharts. We just need to use one of them and explain how you got the 5 risk events. So my recommendation for you is when you use the tools in here, either any tools in here, like fishbone or brainstorming, or checklist or flowcharts, please show they are related to the 5 risks that you generated for the previous task. And then following that, we analyze the risk. Now we remember that this subject basically follows the risk management process framework that we discussed based on the IS NZS ISO 31000 2009. standard. In this instance, after risk identification, we analyze the risk. So here we analyze the likelihood and the consequence of the above risks. Based on the likelihood and consequence, we evaluate and prioritize the above risks for treatment. Now, following that, task C is basically to treat the risk, select and implement treatments. So task A would basically revolve around risk identification. Task B is the risk analysis. C basically revolves around select and implement treatments. So it follows that process basically. You would recall from the framework that we discussed in the subject. Now the first one that we need to do is determine the options to treat the above risk. And after that we develop the action plan to treat the above risk and explain the above action plan, how the above action plan will be communicated to the stakeholder and with the rationale. Now C1, C2, C3 are basically in the context of selecting and implementing treatments. If you like, you could combine them into one template, starting from the risk identification, risk analysis, and risk treatment. You could refer to the template that we discussed in the subject. C4 is basically about documentation. How would we document all the risk action plan and relevant procedures? How would we store the risk action plan and relevant procedures? And also how to implement and monitor the action plan. Explain how you would implement and monitor the action plan. This is basically the detailed side of the action plan that we developed in C2. Now C6 is basically about the reflection. After we develop the risk management plan, we identify the risk, we analyze the risk, we develop the treatment and action plan, we do some reflection in here in order to critically outline how our risk management process could be better in the future. So in this instance, we table the issues that we might have in our risk management process. So that's task C basically. Now I would also recommend you to look at the marking guide in here, task A, B, C, and also the detailed marking guide that has been outlined for the subject. If you look at that, you may want to focus on the well done side of it. So if it has been outlined succinctly with rationale, and also it shows one intact thinking from identification, analysis, treatment, and also the assessment one, which is basically establishing the risk context, then we are basically heading to well done type of work. So that's basically assessment number 2, which is due in week 10. Assessment number 2 due in week 10. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to stay in touch with me. You could send me a message through the portal, or you could also email me. Some students prefer to email me the draft. Please go for it, but I would recommend you not to do it in the last few minutes, because I may not have time to we may not have time for you to address the feedback. Good luck.